Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Northwest Connects, where each month we sit down to talk about the stories shaping Northwest local school district. I'm Angelo, Northwest Communications Specialist, and this is part one in a two-part series about public school funding. Joining me today are Darrell Yater, Superintendent, and CFO and Treasurer Amy Wells, and they're here to help us understand how exactly public school funding works, not only across the state, but specifically here in Northwest Local School District. This is part one of a two-part series. In part two, we're going to talk about some significant changes happening to the existing public school funding system and some challenges coming from the State House due to recent legislation. So make sure to look out for that episode. So let's get started with the basics, right? Where does Northwest funding come from, and how have those funding sources changed over time?
So funding for public schools in the state of Ohio is a three-part component. There is federal, state, and local shares that are calculated into school funding. Most of our funding comes from state and local. The federal funds are restricted and very geared toward very specific purposes. So in Ohio, there is a commitment to a state and local partnership for funding public education. In the 90s, there was a state Supreme Court ruling called Darrell that actually ruled Ohio school funding model unconstitutional. At that point, Ohio became closest to a fair school funding share where 50% of the funding for public education was coming from the state of Ohio. The other 50% was coming from the local communities. That local community share was broken up based on residents and businesses and industry. Over the years, legislature has changed laws and have moved that so that currently the state share for public education across the state of Ohio is about to become the lowest it's ever been in the history of Ohio. So in 2027, it'll move from near 50% down to about 30%. And then the local share that is split between our residents and our businesses, that has shifted from a almost identical split in the 70s to now the businesses paying a lot less than the residents. So the residents are paying about 70% of the cost of public education, and business and industry are paying about 30%. So those shifts in time have moved the burden of public education more on residents, but that model for public education funding in Ohio has been a commitment of a state and local partnership.
Okay, so I want to make sure I have this right. So at a point in time, the partnership between local and state funding was about equal. We had two equal buckets of funding there. But over time, it shifted so that the state is paying less and local taxpayers are paying more. Do I have that right?
Correct, and it wasn't just a shift from state to local, it was a shift from state to local and local to residents.
Right. So between businesses and local taxpayers, they also used to pay about an equal portion of school property taxes.
It was a more equitable split between those three buckets,
right?
And it's shifted over time.
And it's shifted now to the burden mainly being on our residents. So Ohio uses a school funding formula to determine how much it will fund each district. How exactly does that funding formula work?
So the state creates a school funding formula for basic education. And they first look at each local community's capacity to pay, and that capacity is made up of the property valuations and the residential income. And then the state pays the difference of the formula.
So if we look at Northwest funding over the years, we see that the amount that we've received from the state has continued to decrease. Why is that?
So when the state looks at local community capacity, they're looking at our local property values as well as our local residents' income. And our property values and income are greater than other communities across the state. And then on top of that, the current formula is looking at the average cost to educate students in 2022, comparing it to our current valuation and residential income. So that makes our community look even wealthier, which then causes the state to pay even less.
So the state is using what it costs to educate students in 2022 to determine how much funding we should receive in 2025?
Yes, that is correct.
Despite rises in these costs?
Yep.
Okay, so it sounds like there's a lot of factors at play, which kind of means that every district has a slightly different mix of funding. What makes Northwest financial situation and needs unique?
So Northwest is a very unique district. We are a large geographic footprint, 52 square miles, And when you look at the geography of the district, and as Amy mentioned, the state looks at the entire population of that 52 square miles to calculate the wealth and the property tax of the district. But when you look at the community we serve, it doesn't necessarily match what the state is looking at. So we have a high population of economically disadvantaged students. We have a high population of students with disabilities that need additional services and supports, and that costs more to provide those services and supports. We also have a community that has very high expectations for education. So the need to be able to provide College Credit Plus courses, AP courses, gifted services to our students is not funded in basic education. And so those costs to provide the services that our community expects from our district is different than what the state looks at us and says we need to have.
So every district has community members who are skeptical about where their taxpayer dollars are going and understandably want to make sure that their taxpayer dollars are being spent well. What systems are in place in Northwest Local School District to ensure that funds are being used responsibly, and how can community members go and look at that information for themselves?
Our community should be really proud of the work that we've done as a district, because we've done more in terms of answering this question than a lot of other districts across the state of Ohio. We have a 3% partnership that our board has passed 3 times since 2019. That commitment says that we will not increase our operations annually more than 3%. That keeps us within an inflationary growth model and doesn't have us growing faster than we should grow to maintain operations and supports and services. It also helps us make sure that we are staying within a budget and not going beyond that. We have a large commitment to make sure that our resources are matched to our needs. So over 70% of our budget is allocated toward classroom resources. So we are completely prioritizing the education of our students and the support they need to be successful. And we communicate multiple times a year with our community to make sure that they have access to the information of not only what our revenue is, but our expenditures. And so we have a forecast that we present twice a year. We have an annual budget document that we put out every summer that outlines our budget for the next year and our plan for resources. And we put out our PAFR and our CAFR, which are literally the audit from the last year, to say this is how we spent our money. So we are completely transparent with our community, and we are committed to honoring that commitment to manage growth so that we are not going beyond our means and asking for the community for more support more often than we actually need it.
Mm-hmm. All right, so we've got our 3% partnership, which you mentioned, and we've got multiple documents that we send out to the community over the course of a year to keep you informed about where your taxpayer dollars are going within the district. So make sure, if you want to learn more about any of these initiatives, that you visit our website at nwlsd.org. And now that we've got a pretty good understanding of how public school funding works, we're going to move on to part 2 of this series, in which we talk about some changes to this system. Of course, once we start to have a grasp on it, it's changing, right? There are significant legislative changes happening that are going to impact our community greatly and how public school funding works here in Northwest Local School District. So make sure to look out for part 2 of this series.